afternoon. Welcome to Sociology 1 here at Yuba College. All right, just last final heads up. The exam is next Wednesday. You at home, you will have an exam window opening up next Wednesday. The 10th, that is that right? The 9th, that is, going through the following Wednesday to the 16th. So that's your exam window. You guys will be taking it in here on Wednesday the 9th. And it's Scantron 882, a number 2 pencil, and that's for everybody. You guys have to bring your ID too. All right, are we clear on that? And we are busy reviewing for the, oh no, we haven't started reviewing. We are going to be able to, wait, today's Wednesday. We'll have some time to review today. I don't know if you got a chance to look at the review guide, but we'll try to do some reviewing. All right, so the last remaining piece of material we haven't covered yet has to do with Latinos in the USA, and I'm drawing on the work here of Roberto Suro. Now, Suro, well, first of all, one thing we need to talk about is the term Latino itself. We've talked a little bit about the social construction of race and ethnicity, and by the way, Latino is not a race. Race itself is a problematic concept, as we've talked about. Maybe the term ethnicity is a better one in a lot of cases. Races are made up of many ethnic groups, and that's kind of one of the problems with the term race, is that it tries to say that a bunch of different ethnic groups are all the same group because of their skin color. But if you think of like white people, there's a lot of different ethnic groups within white people. There's Scandinavians, there's Eastern Europeans, there's Caucasians, there's Western Europeans, there's Anglos, there's all kinds of different Europeans, Southern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, you know, Basque people, Catalonian people, Portuguese people. I mean, there's all kinds of people all over Europe from different ethnic groups. We tend to call people from Europe white, but because they might have sort of whitish skin. But that really is making similar a whole bunch of group of people that really have a lot of difference. And same with African American, we say black, we're tying together a bunch of ethnic groups. If you went to Africa before slavery, you would have seen hundreds of tribes all over Africa that were very different from each other, ethnically speaking, in terms of facial structure, height, you know, other kinds of physical characteristics. Maybe black skin was one common thing, or dark skin, but again, to say that they're all the same because that's a race is hiding more than it reveals. Latino has never been presented as a race. It's a category that includes people. The category used to be called Hispanic, but even Hispanic has a lot of different ethnic groups in it. Puerto Rican people, Mexican people, and Mexico has many ethnic groups in it, different indigenous Indian groups, different people that came from Spain at one time. So you've got different ethnic groups all over Mexico, not one race in Mexico. And all over the Hispanic world, you've got Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Bolivians, Colombians, Brazilians, I mean, even different languages within that group. And the term Hispanic became problematic partly because it assumes they all speak Spanish, and that's not accurate. Latino has become sort of the preferred term for people in this country who identify as part of this group we're calling Hispanic or Latino. Latino is now the word, although a lot of people, because of gender, we've talked about intersectionality. The Spanish language is very gendered. So if you call somebody a Latino, you know, if he's a male, or a Latina if she's female, well, then you're gendering that person. And some people nowadays who speak Spanish say we should just call them Latinx as the last letter in the word. That would apply both to males and females. Anyway, so, but the point is Latino is a broad term that covers people in America who come from a variety of different places that have very different cultures in many cases and different physical characteristics. So it's not a race, it's a group of people that maybe are tied together by things like speaking Spanish, but not always. Maybe they're tied together more by they come originally from countries that were colonized by Spain. That's one reason they were called Hispanic, is they were cultures that were influenced by Spain originally. But in any case, it's a bit of an ambiguous term, just like white's an ambiguous term and black's an ambiguous term. It's not always clear who's included in it. But what And if you ever fill out the census, it might ask you, are you Latino, but then what race are you? Are you a white Latino or are you a non-white Latino. So in and of itself is not a race, it's a group, a category. But Searle points out that we are a nation of immigrants. I mean, to point out that Latinos are people that have immigrated to America from countries that were colonized by Spain, that's, well, that's true, but everybody in this country came from somewhere. Even Native Americans, that we call them, they came over on an ice bridge or maybe across the ocean or both, but no human being is native to North American continent. And so in that sense, we're all immigrants. But what you notice about Latinos, according to Searle and many others, is Latinos seem to have a distinctive pattern of assimilation. What is assimilation? Ever heard that phrase, word?
Like I was going to say coming together.
A little more specific. If we're talking about immigrants assimilating into a culture.
To be consumed by a larger whole?
Huh?
To be consumed by a larger whole?
Yeah, you will be assimilated. Wasn't that a line in a movie? The Borg, wasn't that what they used to say on Star Trek? Well, it kind of means that, but what it especially means when it comes to immigration is, have you as a person or as a group assimilated the culture of the place that you've moved to? In other words, in America, it might mean things like beginning to speak English, the dominant language of North America or of the United States, or eating hamburgers and hot dogs instead of pierogies or Chinese noodles or whatever you left behind in your previous culture. Are you adopting the culture, the clothing, the language, the food, the music, the ways, the thinking of the new culture? And Latinos, everybody in America eventually kind of assimilates into the American culture. And for most immigrant groups, it happens within like 2 or 3 generations. I don't know about you, I see a lot of people in here who I can guess that your parents are a little different than you, maybe a little more traditional culture than some of you. Maybe they speak less English than you. Maybe they are a little more tied to a different country's culture than this one. I know in my case, the first person that came to this country in my family who was not from here was my grandma, who came from Russia. And she spoke Russian, and she spoke Yiddish, a Jewish language from Europe. She didn't speak any English when she got here at like 17 years old. She learned English during the time she was here, and by the time I knew her, when she was, in her 60s and 70s, she spoke English, but with an accent. My mom, her daughter, grew up speaking, she was born in New York. She spoke Yiddish and English in the home. She speaks English without any kind of accent. You would never know she speaks any other kind of language, but she speaks Yiddish fluently too. Me, I speak English kind of, but I never learned Yiddish, I didn't learn Russian, so you could say the 3rd generation or the 2nd generation here, I'm assimilated. And for most immigrant groups, when they come here, the first people to get here don't really assimilate. Their children assimilate a little bit, and the 2nd generation then, or 3rd, they are more fully assimilated. And I don't know what your patterns are if you think of your moms and grandmas, or which generation of your family became fully Americanized. Latinos, though, tend to be a little slower than others in America as immigrant groups to fully assimilate. They do assimilate, but it might take 4, 5, 6 generations rather than 2 or so. So why is that? So Searle asks about this. Well, we all immigrate here, but why are Latinos taking a little longer, several generations more than others on average? And here he points to the conditions of immigration. Can you think of things that might affect a group's immigration patterns? What we might call the conditions of immigration. What sorts of things might affect your immigration experience?
Whether they move to the same populated ethnicity versus, like, I don't know, say a Mexican family were to move into a black neighborhood. Or
okay, yeah, so where are you moving to? But let's start first with where are you moving from? When we talk about conditions of immigration, one issue is why? Why did you migrate? Why did you leave the area that you left? If you think of your immigrant family, and again, I'm assuming everyone in here is an immigrant in some sense, even if you're Native American. Maybe you don't have a history of them coming over the ice bridge. But most of us probably know the history of how we got here, and when we think back on that, why was that? In my case, my Russian grandma, why did she leave in her teenage years, leave Russia to come here? Well, at that time, Russia was ruled by the Tsar, Russian Tsar. He didn't like Jewish people and started invading Jewish villages with guys on horseback and killing people and raping people. So if you wanted to live, you might want to leave Russia. So they did. So religious persecution, for example, might be one kind of problem. Can you think of other reasons why migrants come to this country?
Better job opportunities.
Okay, economic opportunities. What other kinds of reasons? Right now we're facing some just gave it away. War. So right now there's Syrians trying to come into America and some people trying to fight against that, but like war and refugee situations, big tragedies like floods or whatever, where people are just displaced and need a new place to live. Crime might push people out, so, some kind of threat to life and limb. So that's one condition. When we think about Mexican Americans, especially when I'm talking about Latinos, Suro mainly is focused on Mexican Americans, and they're the single largest group of people that identify as Latino in our culture. But in some ways, their conditions of immigration have been a lot different than other groups. For example, if you compare Mexican Americans to Cuban Americans, you'll see quite a few differences in terms of their experiences here in America. And again, it goes back to, well, where were you leaving and why? And Cubans came here, they were some of the richest Cubans coming from Cuba because Cuba had a revolution. So some of the richest Cubans left Cuba and came to America. When we talk about Mexico, who are we talking about? Who comes to this country from Mexico? Well, economic opportunity is one of the main things. But if you leave your country because of religious persecution, and you leave your country because of economic opportunities, then that's a very different condition of migration. What might be some differences between those groups of people that might affect their experience once they get here? Like, why would you end up in a neighborhood of a totally different ethnic group than you? Or why might you not end up in a neighborhood like that? If you ended up in a neighborhood with a bunch of people that don't speak like you, don't look like you, you might need to assimilate a little bit more. On the other hand, if you end up in a neighborhood where everybody speaks your same language and thinks like you might not need to assimilate. But what I'm getting at here is people who leave for religious persecution, they might be people that already have skills, that already have wealth, that already have education. And so if they come to a new culture, they're in a position to start assimilating because, for one thing, maybe they start a new business. They take this money they have and they open a business. If you open a business, then you're going to have to deal with people from the new culture you're in, and you better learn their language or you're going to learn it because you're dealing with them. On the other hand, if you come for economic opportunity, like many poor Mexicans, what are you bringing over with you? Not much. Maybe no money, maybe very few skills. And what can you do when you get here? Well, you take what you can get. Maybe you have to work in the fields. And if you're working in the fields picking strawberries, you're surrounded by other people that speak Spanish all day. You're surrounded all day by other people who eat Mexican food for their lunch and their dinner. So you're not really in a position to start assimilating. You don't have to, and you can't. You're working sun up to sundown in the fields. You're not making much money. The money you do make, maybe you're sending a lot of it back home. So you're in a condition where assimilation isn't much of an option. Whereas if you came over for religious persecution, maybe you're very much in a situation where you need to assimilate and you can assimilate. Same with refugees. Refugees sometimes come here because the government itself asked them to come over and help to resettle them and gave them resources and networks to be part of and language classes to take and things like that. So that's a different condition of immigration, and it might affect your experience once you're here. But Mexican Americans, by and large, have come here for because seeking economic opportunities. That means we get from Mexico, I mean, the way Trump put it is they're sending us their worst people. Well, I don't agree with how he put it. But people who need to leave their country are people that don't have much, that don't have job opportunities, don't have much money. And that's what they're trying to find. So if they're coming here, they don't have that. And if you don't have that, you're not really in a position to start assimilating really quickly. Another condition of immigration might be geography. How does the physical landscape affect people's immigration experience? What's the difference, say, between migrating from 6,000 miles away or 9,000 miles away over the Atlantic Ocean from Russia versus migrating from Mexico, which is contiguous with the United States? It's connected by land to the United States. So what might be some differences there?
In a way of putting it, there's a lot more points of contact, where if you come from someplace that's not directly connected like Mexico is, you have to come either through a harbor or an airport, and probably have to go through some kind of more directly official channel, because I feel like those are much more guarded.
Well, it would be, yeah, it's fairly easy to walk across a piece of land to get into a new country, but it's not only easier to migrate that way in some sense. It means money. I mean, you can't get across the ocean unless you have the means to do that. So people who are able to escape religious persecution or war tend to be people with the means to do that. And if they have the means, they already have some skills and some education usually. The poorest people in those countries didn't successfully escape and, you know, ended up dead or in the war or in the persecution or whatever. But another issue is just being far away geographically. If you're 6,000 or 9,000 miles away from your home culture and you have to cross an ocean to get to it, it's going to be hard to find Russian food over here. My grandma probably didn't find too much Russian food in America when she got here. It's hard to listen to Russian music if you're in America and that's not what they're playing on the radio station. It's hard to hear Russian newscasts if you're way over here. But so she had to listen to American newscasts and American music and eat American food, and so she kind of had to assimilate. If the place you immigrated from is just a few miles away on the same piece of land, well, you can still hear Mexican radio here in California. You can still eat Mexican food here in California. You can still speak Spanish. I mean, this state was once a Hispanic state. It was colonized by Spain. So it's not really like you're leaving your land in a way. You're just moving to a different part of it with a different border. And so in a lot of ways, it's a very different experience of migrating from, you know, over an ocean than it is from a contiguous landmass. And so for all these reasons, for one thing, a lot of Mexican Americans are not in a position to start adopting the home culture of the United States once they get here. And they're also not in a situation where they really have to do that. Another issue is if you're poor, you pretty much have to find people like yourself. You couldn't go live in a neighborhood of a bunch of English-speaking people if you didn't speak any English. You're probably going to have to find other immigrants that speak Spanish. You're going to have to find a place to live with them. Oh, we know a place you can get a place to live. Can you help me get a job? Can you tell me where I can shop? Where can I find the foods that I know how to cook and eat and I'm used to eating? You're going to rely on the networks of other immigrants like yourself. And so you're going to be in their company. And again, you're going to be speaking Spanish, eating Mexican food, not really in a position to be in contact with a whole bunch of English-speaking Americans. And I noticed, for example, having grown up in Southern California in some ways is more Mexican than Northern California. And I even noticed that Mexican-American culture is different in Southern California than it is up here. And just an example would be in Santa Barbara where I grew up, everybody pronounces all the street names in Spanish. Like we don't say Cabrillo Street, we say Cabrillo Street. We don't say Gutierrez Street, we say Gutierrez Street. We speak in Spanish down there and it's expected that you would. Up here I noticed people anglicize all the Spanish sounding names of things. There's even a guy, the supervisor, county supervisor of this area we're in right now, Linda, is a guy named, he calls himself Andy Vasquez. I grew up calling a guy like that Antonio Vasquez, you know, but he doesn't call himself that. And so that tells you the further you get away from Mexico up into Northern California, the more anglicized it gets, the more assimilated people are and have to be. I also noticed you can't really get good Mexican food up here. So I always need to go back to Santa Barbara to get good Mexican food. But anyway, so it's, but that sense of climbing up through California, you get to see more and more assimilation of Mexican and Anglo culture. That gets to Searle's next point, which is Mexican Americans do assimilate. It just takes them a little longer, and the way they've normally done it is through what we can call the ladder of assimilation. At the bottom rung, so there's rungs of this ladder. And the rungs are basically different positions in our economy. If you're an immigrant coming in, poor, unskilled, uneducated, with nothing but the shirt on your back, and these are people coming into the country from the south, that's my little lines there. What can you do? What's the first rung you can climb onto to climb yourself into American culture? Well, usually it's low-level laboring work, basically like migrant farm worker. And if you're a migrant farm worker, like I said, the chances you're going to start adopting the mainstream culture of America are not very high. You're out in the fields all day with other people that speak your language. You're eating your same foods. You're doing hard work all day. You're not making much money, so you don't have much time or money left over to go take English classes or go even watch TV in English or things like that. So you're just not really in a position where you're going to start speaking English and learning American culture. But your child, if you're able to have children while you're here, or you do have children while you're here, they're with you, and they might be much more exposed to American culture. They might go to school or hang out in the neighborhood with other kids, and they're picking up English. And that kid might find himself in a job like a little higher up on the ladder, like maybe a farm labor contractor. Maybe his job is not to actually go out and do the picking, but to help round up the guys for the growers that can do that. And if you're rounding up guys, you're speaking Spanish, but you're also dealing with growers, and you're speaking English and reading English, and you're a little more assimilated at that point. But probably you still speak Spanish most of the time. You probably still speak Spanish at home and are living a mainly Mexican lifestyle at home. But what about his kids? His kids graduate high school and are able to have a high school diploma and maybe go work in a factory. And factory jobs, as we've learned in this class, sometimes are good middle class jobs. You could be making a good hourly wage, you could have benefits. You're probably speaking English full time now all day long. Maybe you still speak Spanish at home. Maybe you still primarily have Mexican food at home, but you're dressing in a more Americanized way, you're speaking American English, you're living a more Americanized life. His kid not only went to high school, but went to college and got a job being the factory manager. And now you're a college-educated American, you're higher up on the scale, you're definitely solidly middle class, you're speaking English most of the time, you're feeding your family meatloaf and hot dogs and hamburgers sometimes, and tacos occasionally. And his kid went to graduate school and became a doctor or a lawyer or a professional of some kind. I like to use Antonio Villaraigosa as my example up here. He was the mayor of Los Angeles for a while, one of the most powerful mayors in the United States. Very high up on the ladder of American status. He's getting ready to maybe run for governor. He's deciding right now, they said in the paper, whether he'll run for governor. I like to use it as an example because Antonio Villaraigosa, that's a very Spanish-sounding name. If you see Antonio, he's a dark-skinned man. But Mr. Antonio Villaraigosa, yo hablo más español que él. He doesn't speak much Spanish, that guy. And he took a lot of flack in LA. Like, you're the leader of the Latino community in LA, and you're the mayor of one of the biggest towns with the biggest population of Latinos in the country, and you don't speak Spanish. So he was a guy that was fully assimilated, is what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is people do assimilate, but it takes several generations, not just one or two. And it depends on climbing the economic ladder into a mainstream American life. Now, what about globalization? Because again, we've seen in the other two readings, the other two things we've talked about when it came to race. We talked about laissez-faire racism when it came to blacks and whites. We talked about racialization of Asian Americans. And in both those cases, we saw how globalization is changing the situation in terms of race in our culture. How might globalization be affecting the situation for Latinos based on this ladder that I'm talking about? Which rungs of the ladder are most negatively affected by globalization? When you think back to this country, when you think back to this class, and we talked about globalization, we said certain kinds of jobs in America are the ones that have been most affected by globalization. They've been the ones most likely to leave this country and go to other countries. Which kinds of jobs were those that we talk about?
Factory jobs.
Factory jobs. So which rungs on this ladder would be the ones that would be the least available anymore because of globalization? This one, factory job, and factory manager. Those jobs are a lot less available. So when we look back at the history of Latinos in this country, factory work has been one of the ways that they've climbed their way into the mainstream of American culture. And Suro is pointing out here, well, those rungs aren't really there anymore. So we still have a lot of Latinos coming into America. And they're not just coming from Mexico. They come from Central America, like El Salvador and Nicaragua, and they come from South America. And a lot of Latinos still are hoping to climb the ladder into American culture. But if there's no rungs here for them to climb to, what happens? Well, people end up pooling. Pooling means they're not flowing forward like a river. They're just staying down at the bottom, pooling in low-level service work. So it's not even agriculture necessarily anymore. Agriculture has also been affected by globalization. I mean, a lot of the things we even used to produce in this area, now China outproduces us cheaper. So we, for example, I mean, and I'm not an expert, but like stone peaches, you know, with pits in them, you know, those are ones that China, I guess, produces cheaper than we do here. But anyway, so agricultural work isn't always it. It's low-level service work that people are competing for nowadays. What kind of work? Well, like landscaping work, domestic work, cleaning people's houses, low-level retail work like working at Walmart or being a dishwasher in a restaurant or other kinds of low-level service work. And by the way, I read a statistic the other day, something like 70% of all dishwashers in restaurants in the United States are illegal immigrants. This is something we don't much talk about and probably should about the whole illegal immigration debate. We always focus on the people being the illegal immigrant, but there's plenty of people making money off of illegal immigrants, and we never vilify them and say, why are you hiring so many people illegal to clean your dishes? Why aren't you looking at their papers and stuff? And there's a whole industry of like fake social security numbers out there and stuff, and so it's not just immigrants, illegal immigrants that are benefiting from illegal immigration, if even they are, but it is more the industries that benefit by paying people low. And sometimes they like cracking down on illegal immigrants. By cracking down on them, you make the labor even cheaper because people will work for even less the more fearful they are of being deported. So are we really trying to crack down on illegal immigration because we don't want illegals here? Or are we cracking down on it because the people who benefit can make even more money? I'll just mention Donald Trump here. There's a lot of documented cases of him hiring people illegally across the border to work for him for below minimum wage. But he says he wants to build a wall. Why? Maybe make it even harder for them to get here so they'll work for even less. But anyway, so people benefit from this illegal immigration is what I'm saying. But meanwhile, the people who are coming here, they're finding, well, I can't even climb out of that low-level work because that's all that's available and there's nothing to get to from there. And meanwhile, you got a lot of other people who used to be on these rungs, middle-class people who had good blue-collar middle-class jobs, they're now competing with immigrants for these low-level service jobs. If we think of the movie Two American Families, for example, Tony Newman lost his good factory job. He was in the middle class. Where did he have to go looking for work? In the low-level service sector. So he was riding around on his bike trying to get hired by like Jack in the Box or whatever fast foods were there, Arby's or whatever, Hardee's he talked about. And fast food, you know, you would be competing maybe for other recent immigrants for that kind of work. He ended up losing his house. I don't know if you remember who bought their house in that movie. It was Asian immigrants. Now, she didn't hate on the Asian immigrants. She was mad that her house got foreclosed, Terry Newman, and she was mad at the bank. She's like, you guys sold it for $30,000 because I owed you 100 something. Well, if you just let me pay it off, you would have got that 100,000, but instead you sold it out from under me for 30. So she was angry at the bank, not at the immigrants, but you could see how a lot of people in this boat, Americans who are not immigrants or don't see themselves that way, and now find themselves competing for jobs with people who they see as recent immigrants or illegal immigrants, or competing for neighborhoods and houses for illegal immigrants. In LA, when I was there, and like I say, Southern California experiences more of this problem than Northern California. I mean, this latter isn't referring to California here, but it's down here, the entry point of a lot of immigrants is Southern California. And that's where they end up pooling. You stay in LA or San Diego because that's where you could find some work, but you weren't able to climb out of that. Meanwhile, you got a lot of formerly middle-class white people and black people and Latino people competing for jobs with these newer immigrants. That means maybe increased hostility, increased ethnic hostility. If you've got a lot of different groups competing for the same crumbs left by globalization, these low-level service jobs, then people start competing with each other, and there's hostility. In LA, you've got whole neighborhoods that used to be black neighborhoods, like Compton and Watts. They're known for being black neighborhoods. They're increasingly becoming Latino neighborhoods. And one thing that was happening while I was there was hate crimes by black people against Latinos and by Latinos against blacks. So there was this trend of if you were a black guy just sitting at a bus stop in a neighborhood that was now mostly Latino, you might just get shot. And vice versa. If you were a Latino person sitting in a neighborhood that was still mostly black, you might just get shot. And this was a change in race relations, because when we think back to LA, we usually think of white people and Latinos having hostility. Like there was a famous case of the Zoot Suit riots back in the 50s when Latino young guys fought with white, sailors and stuff like that. And there's been other cases of white and black hostility, white and Latino hostility. Nowadays in LA, it's more like brown on brown hostility. Either you have browns versus black people, or another thing you have in LA is different Latino groups having conflict with each other. For example, the biggest gang in LA, or the scariest gang, is 18th Street, which is known as Mara Salvatrucha, which is a Salvadoran gang, and they sometimes have conflict with more Mexican-American gangs. And so I'm not an expert on gangs, but what I'm saying is you've got ethnic tension between different Latino groups in LA. Meanwhile, in LA, white people are mostly on the west side of town, and so they've kind of been left out of some of the newer conflicts going on in this more service-based, globalized world where the tension is more in those kind of neighborhoods. Formerly, neighborhoods that were supported by factory work and things, and the factories aren't there anymore. So people are competing over things like, well, who gets to cut people's lawns? Who gets to work at Walmart? Who gets to live in this, ghetto neighborhood? So again, Suro is helping us see that a changing economy is having major effects on relations between different ethnic and racial groups in the society. And we see that in all three of the analyses that we've talked about under race. So I want to make this point again, that racism and racial tension maybe isn't just it's not a matter just of individual beliefs. We have a tendency in our society to focus on individual people and their beliefs, and we tend to think of if there's a problem with racism, it must be people's individual beliefs. And so we should, a lot of times they'll say, if we could just have more sensitivity training, if we could just teach white people to like people that aren't white, and if we could teach non-white people to like people that are white, then we won't have racial problems. And that's not a very sociological way of looking at things, because sociology says it isn't so much about people's individual feelings that's at issue here. What's issue is groups and their access to things and the power and wealth they have or don't have. And so a basic point that all three of our analyses have made is we shouldn't see race in terms of as education goes up, as more and more people get educated and learn to like other people and accept other people, that somehow racism will go down, or prejudice will go down. I mean, to some extent it is true that you can reduce prejudice. You can reduce people's feelings about each other, or change them, or open people's minds. But that's not really the source necessarily of conflicts, of people like shooting each other on the street. I don't think people taking a sensitivity class in college would necessarily stop shootings of people. So what's the real issue there? It's not a linear thing. It's not like racism has inevitably gone down since 1900, when nobody had college educations, and now lots of people do. It's not like we've become so much better at relating to each other on the issue of race. We've become somewhat better, but a better way to look at it might be that it goes up and down over time, racial hostility. When it comes to blacks and whites, we saw that group position. When whites are far above blacks, they generally are less hostile to them. When they feel more close together, they feel a little more hostility. Especially when whites feel like they've gone down in the world. When it comes to Asians, as we talked about, when America itself feels threatened economically or militarily, that's when we feel more hostile, or Asians experience more hostility in our own culture. When it comes to Latinos, what explains the up and down? Well, it sort of has to do with how much America wants Latinos. During the 1940s, there was low hostility. So what I'm talking about here is like hostility towards Latinos. And it's been high at times in our history, and it's been lower at times in our history. The 1940s were a time when hostility towards Latinos went way down. Why was that? The US government basically invited a whole bunch of Mexican-American people to come up here. Why? 1940s was when we were at war with Germany and Japan and Italy, and so many white young men were sent off to fight in the war, and so we didn't have enough people to work in the factories building bombs and missiles and ships and all that stuff, so America faced a labor shortage. And when we had a labor shortage, we were very welcoming to Mexican people to come up here and work in our factories, and there was something called the Bracero program, where people were invited to come work here. And then when the war ended, they were kind of told, well, it was, adios, we don't need you anymore. But that doesn't really work out in social terms. You can't just tell a group of people, well, you're not needed, go back home. People had families, they had lives here. They weren't necessarily ready to pick up, stakes and leave. But the point is at times when we've needed more Mexican laborers, when we want people to pick our strawberries and clean our houses, and we feel that we can afford to pay for that, then we're like, yeah, we like Mexican people. On the other hand, it's a time like right now, there seems to be a lot of hostility. And a guy's running for president largely on the idea that he's hostile against these foreigners and he's going to keep them out. And lots of people are, sympathetic to that. You even see quite a few Latinos saying, yeah, we got to crack down on illegal immigration. So what's that tell you about right now? It's not just not liking Latinos, it's economic tension. It's when people feel like there's plenty of jobs and I don't want to pick strawberries. Well, yeah, bring him up here. Let him pick the strawberries because I got a better job making computers or whatever. But when people are worried, like I might want to get a job picking strawberries because I don't have another job, then that might be when they... And I picked that one because I don't know anyone who wants to pick strawberries. Like that's a really crappy job. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it's like this all day. And you're breathing pesticides most of the time. And it's not good work. So I always wonder why people are hostile towards illegal immigrants, because the work they're doing is not work most of us want to do. I don't know too many people that want to cut my lawn. I don't know too many people that want to clean my toilets. But anyway, so if we keep people out, who's going to do that work? But I guess in today's period, when people are worried about their own jobs and not having one, then they start saying, well, maybe I want to start a landscaping business. Maybe I'm going to go clean people's toilets. Maybe I'll pick strawberries. So it's not prejudice, it's necessarily. Although I do wonder why people aren't worried about Texans. I mean, the way the United States is set up, all our borders are open. People from Nevada could be moving to California at will right now. They could all be coming here to take our jobs. Why doesn't anyone ever get mad about Nevadans coming over, or Oregonians, or South Dakotans or something like that? I mean, the whole United States is open. You can move to any state you want. So why are people so worried about the southern border of California and the people coming over that one? If you're worried about people from outside California coming in here to take our jobs, why are you only worried about those people? And so there is a little bit of prejudice behind the anger at Latinos specifically, and they're legally crossing the border. Well, so if they legally cross the border like Arizonans, then you like them? Anyway, so there is a bit of prejudice and racism involved in it, but also it's rooted, generally speaking, in group tensions, not so much individual people and their feelings. And so if we want to reduce tensions, we need to think more in terms of the economics of the situation. And if everybody had access to good education, good jobs, good health care, people wouldn't be so worried about somebody else's access to it. And if they knew that they had their own access to it as well. So anyway, that's what we have to say about race. Where can we begin our review of things? Well, one thing is I haven't told you what the essay question is. And that's a good reason for that, is I haven't thought it up yet. I promise that by today, I will give you one. I can tell you what it's likely to be about. In other words, essay questions should be what I would call synthetic. In other words, I wouldn't ask an essay question that just said, what does Searle mean by ladder of assimilation? Because that's only asking you to know one concept from one author, from one piece of our material on race. If I'm going to ask you an essay question, it's likely going to ask you to show knowledge of several different concepts over several different topics that we covered. Like on this chapter, on this test, we're covering race and gender. So probably my essay question will have something to do with trying to discuss both those things at once. A good place to start then maybe would be one of the very first terms on our review guide is intersectionality. And intersectionality is sort of the cutting edge concept right now that lots of people are talking about. And sociology can be kind of proud of this because sociologists kind of were turned on to this idea or came up with this idea before others have. It really started in legal studies. It was a legal scholar trying to understand race and how to deal with race in a legal context that led her to come up with this term intersectionality. But it also relates to the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who's a radical sociologist, who, as we talked earlier in this class, radical sociology tries to link race, class, and gender as all sort of part of the same thing, that you can't really understand someone's gender unless you know more about their race and class. And you can't really understand their class without taking account of their gender and their race. And you can't really understand someone's racial experience without knowing something about their class and their gender. And so the three things are linked together. A good example I like to use, and I don't want to offend people, but I probably will. You know, Donald Trump. A lot of people say this presidential race is about gender because it's a man versus a woman. And a lot of the issues that have been brought up have been about gender, like things the male candidate may have said behind closed doors on a video, on an open mic, versus things he's willing to say publicly. And so a lot of the debate about the presidential campaign has been about gender. But a sociologist might say, well, can we really just talk it up to gender? Because, for example, let's say Donald Trump was a black man, and it came out that on a tape, on a video, he was talking about grabbing women's genitals. Would our culture see that in the same light? Because Donald Trump just said, well, that's just locker room talk. That's just how guys talk. And a lot of people said, oh, that's just how guys talk. Give him a pass. But if he was a black guy, would we say that's just how guys talk? And when we say it's okay that he's running for president and he says those things about women, if he had been a working class, uneducated black guy saying that, would we say that's fine? Or does Donald Trump get a different treatment about it because not only is he a man, but an very wealthy white man, and so we say, well, it's okay for him to talk that way. That's just normal how he talks, but when it's somebody else with different race and class, maybe we see it in a little bit different terms. So in some ways I see, and really the concept intersectionality started with trying to understand people who are multiply oppressed. Like if you're it often came out of the women's movement, because the women's movement said, well, we're all sisters. We're all women. We all have vaginas, so we're all on the same team, right, girls? And some women in the feminist movement began to say, well, you white women leading the movement, you're upper class, college-educated white women, and the issues you think are important are not the issues I find important. As a black woman who's not, have a history of education, come from poor ghetto, maybe my issues are different than your issues over there. Like you're all worried about being a lesbian or something like that, and whether that's okay, and maybe that's not my main issue. And so a lot of tensions emerged in the feminist movement over what are women's issues. And what became clear is women's issues might differ depending on your race and your class. And so you can't just say, let's just focus on your gender and that's who you are. It's all these things. So I'm likely to ask a question about intersectionality. I'm likely to ask you something along the lines of, well, what is intersectionality and why do we need to account for it when analyzing certain things? That's a little vague. So I might say, for example, something that asks you to talk about the video too. We watched Tough Guys. And Tough Guys, I think, was a good video to choose because it also tried to show how if we want to understand gender, masculinity, we can't look at it in isolation from class issues and race issues. So I might ask you something along the lines of, what is intersectionality and what were some examples from Tough Guys of why this concept is important? Does that make sense? Do those questions make sense that I'm giving you? So again, I'm trying to say I'm going to ask you an essay question that forces you to talk about both gender and race and ask you to integrate several different materials from our class, like the video and my lectures, or like the video and some of these readings I've been talking about. So does that make sense? So I want us to really understand how race and gender and class are connected, and how people's performances. I mean, symbolic interactionism is more concerned with the cultural side of race, class, and gender than the structural side. So it's more interested in things like how people present themselves in interactions and stuff like that. So even people's performances of how they present themselves to others. Tough Guys, if you want an example from that movie to talk about in your essay, well, as they talked about, a lot of non-white guys, they talked about the cool pose. A lot of non-white guys in America tend to express their masculinity in a kind of scary way. They walk around, big muscles, scary looking tattoos. It seems that they're trying to scare people with their masculinity. And Jackson Katz in the movie was asking, well, why would men of color, especially poorer men of color, why would their masculinity be about big muscles and tough and scary things? Whereas if you look at more like upper class white guys, like, I don't know what a good example of that would be. I don't know, Johnny Depp or something like that. His masculinity is not all macho, tough, and scary, and tattoos. He's got long hair. He's into more feminine things. I mean, so how does class affect a white guy's, his upper class and his race, allow him to express his masculinity maybe in different ways? As the movie put it, if you come from a community where you don't have money, where you don't have good educational opportunities, the only way you can prove to people that they should respect you might be your body, how scary you are, how big you are, how much you might be violent. And if that's your way to get respect, I mean, that tells you what's missing from those communities. If you have other things to get respect with, like look at my huge house and all my cars and all my fancy clothes, then you don't have to worry about how tough you look. You could walk around in penny loafers and pink pants and a checkered shirt and say, you want to go play some tennis? You know what I'm saying? So I'm trying to say upper class white guys, their masculinity sometimes is quite a bit different from working class non-white guys. So that's an example, and in the movie, an example they used was Indian. These two Native American guys are sitting on a bus, and they're talking about, how do you be a real Indian? And the guy was saying, well, if you want white people to respect you as a real Indian, you have to be scary. You have to not smile and look tough. And the guy was saying, well, that's not how we really are, because our tribe, we were fishermen, not hunters. And he's like, well, you got to look like a warrior, like a hunter. And so it's a pose. A lot of non-white guys trying to look scarier than they are, trying to look tougher than they are, because they believe that to get respect in a white-dominated, upper-class-dominated society, that fear is going to be the way they're going to get respect. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. Does that make a little more sense? And there's other examples we've used in this class about how race, class, and gender intersect to create not only people's identities and their performances, but also the structure of domination in our society. If we want to know who's the top of our society, it isn't just men, it's upper class white men. And if we at the bottom, you know, it's different set of intersecting characteristics that create that structure. All right. What other questions do you have from the material? I would say laissez-faire racism is one of the more difficult concepts, and there's several questions on our exam about that. So is there anybody that would like me to go over that idea again? Yeah, you would. Okay, let's go over that one a little bit. I don't know the best way to proceed here. I mean, probably to go in order of things. But I think some of the gender stuff is pretty straightforward. There's a few things on there that you might need to look at your book. So I'm not going to get quite to laissez-faire racism. When it comes to gender, though, some things I want to make sure you understand. Another concept, by the way, that could help you talk about intersectionality is binary oppositions. We tried to show there that idea. Maybe I'll go over that in a second too. But binary oppositions, we brought it up under gender, but it applies to race as well. And so that's a concept that links the two topics that we're talking about. And so that might be one that I may or may not ask about on an essay, or I may give you a choice of essay questions, or you might want to use that as an example of intersectionality. Anyway, we'll think about it. Gender, I'm not going to go through all the questions, but there's two concepts on your study guide that we might want to call attention to. Glass ceiling. I don't know if I ever talked about glass ceiling in here. As I've talked about before in this class, the exams are mostly based on my lecture, but every once in a while there's things that might be in the book that I didn't talk about. Normally I wouldn't test you on something that was in the book that I didn't talk about, so I'm going to talk about it now if I didn't already. Who knows what the glass ceiling refers to?
Well, with gender, I mean, how the level of where females have gotten into positions of power here.
Right, and what is that? What does the glass ceiling suggest?
Well, that it's lower for female gender than.
Right.
The glass ceiling refers to the fact that they can like look up to the higher positions and have aspirations of reaching there, but never actually get there. There's a glass ceiling in the way.
In other words, women have come pretty far in our society. They've gotten almost to the very top of a lot of positions in our society. So if we look at business, there's a lot of women who are vice presidents of big corporations. If we look at universities and colleges, there's a lot of women who are professors now, and deans, and vice presidents, and vice chancellors. If we look at the United States government, we've had some female senators, and some female secretaries of cabinets, like Secretary of State and other cabinets. We still haven't had a female president. We still don't have that many female presidents of universities and colleges. There's some. We still don't have that many female CEOs of big corporations. And so it's those very top positions that are still that last layer that women haven't quite broken through. They've broken through in some cases, and on Tuesday this next week, maybe there'll be another ceiling broken, and a female will occupy the White House. But that is what is meant. So it's really getting at the question of structural inequality between the genders. And we didn't focus more on structure. This whole time we've been talking about gender and race, we've been focusing more on culture, because that's where symbolic interactionism focuses its attention, on people's beliefs, their attitudes, their feelings. Structure more has to do with who has what, who has which money, which jobs, which education. And so this is a structural question. Are women and are females and males structurally equal in America today? And they're not. Women have come a long way, but there's still some major areas where they haven't achieved equality. And it's those top positions is one of them. And so that's another question on the test is, are genders equal? and your textbook brings that up, and I didn't really get into it here with things. I didn't give you a lot of statistics on like pay of women and, you know, education levels. But your textbook does get into that, so you should read the textbook and learn that stuff. And that's, you know, when Americans talk about gender, a lot of times that's what they're really more focused on, is the structural side of things, not the culture of it. But where does your textbook come down on that? Are they equal? Well, it says they've achieved a lot of equality, but it's not perfect yet. And there's still some major areas in American society and the economy where women haven't achieved parity or equality with men. And so it's sort of like that old cigarette ad that used to say, "You've come a long way, baby." That was kind of a sinister ad because it was trying to say, women, if you're really liberated, now you'll smoke cigarettes just like men. And I don't know if that's a real sign of freedom, that you get to get cancer too. But that's what Virginia Slims was trying to say, the cigarette company. "You've come a long way, baby," meaning, and the ad used to show some woman from like the 1800s sneaking a cigarette behind a bush. And now she can smoke publicly wherever she wants to go. So a lot of feminists didn't like that ad because it was using feminism to sell cigarettes. But yeah, women have come a long way. They're much more equal than they used to be in America, but still face glass ceilings and other barriers to full equality. All right, those were some things I wanted to make sure I covered, because I did promise you I wouldn't make you know things I didn't cover, but I covered it. And then what else? So laissez-faire racism. This term is hard on a number of levels. First of all, it's in French, so that's not helpful. And then it's dealing in a complicated way with a lot of sociological ideas at once. So I want to make sure we understand it. First of all, laissez-faire in French means let it be or hands off, but it really means no government involvement. So if you're somebody who says, I have a laissez-faire attitude about that thing, what you're saying is, I don't think the government should be involved in that thing. So for example, an example of no government involvement would be the economy. Some people say the government shouldn't be involved in, well, what we really should say is economic relationships. The government shouldn't get in the middle, let's say, of a boss and his employee. It should be up to those two to decide, how much am I getting paid? How am I getting treated? How safe is my job? Those kinds of things. So the government shouldn't regulate like pay or safety or anything like that. That's what a true laissez-faire economic view would be. Well, what about race relationships? Should the government be involved in the relations between blacks and whites, or between Latinos and whites, or between Asians and blacks, or Asians and Latinos, or any of those groups? And laissez-faire racism is the belief, it's the ideology that says, no, the government shouldn't be involved in racial relationships. And so Bobo and Smith, that's the authors of this idea that I'm talking about, they say that laissez-faire racism, and I will just abbreviate it as LFR, LFR is the dominant racial ideology in the US today. But a key term there for them is today, because one of the things they want to say is, help us see, is this hasn't always been our racial ideology. And so part of what they're trying to help us understand is how America's dominant racial ideology has changed over time. And what do they mean it's the dominant racial ideology today? Well, they mean when you ask a lot of Americans today, how do you feel about race relationships? Do you think the government should be involved in them? A lot of Americans today say, no, I don't favor that. What kinds of things are we talking about? Well, if you say, for example, should the government help poor black people, get education and get a job? A lot of people today might say, I don't know, that doesn't sound right. Let them help themselves. Should the government make sure black people can get into universities and colleges, at a reasonable rate? I don't know, that sounds like you'd be discriminating against white people then. So these are the kinds of issues. Should the government be, trying to create more equality between the races? And a lot of Americans today say, no, they don't think they favor that. And Bobo and Smith say it's the dominant racial ideology in the sense that lots of people think that way. But they're also saying it's the dominant racial ideology because it comes from the dominant groups. The people who run our society are the ones who created this idea, and they've spread it to other people. So when they say it's a dominant racial ideology, they're saying it's a way of looking at things that a lot of people have, but where did it come from? And did they always think this way? And so, to really understand their argument, we have to, I'm trying to see if I'm on camera here, we have to understand what do they mean by dominant racial ideology? And what is its purpose? What is its function? And they're not really functionalists, they're conflict theorists. And conflict theorists, if you remember from that earlier in the class, ideology is one of the key ideas for conflict theorists. Ideology is this tool that people in power use to help maintain their power. The best way to stay powerful is if you can convince the people below you that you should be in power and that they shouldn't. If people accept it as legitimate, if they say, yeah, it's right, you should be up there and I should be down here, then that's the best way to do it, because if you're the powerful people, you want people below it to accept it. I don't know if you've ever had power over somebody, like your kids. If you ever have kids, you don't want your kids questioning your authority every day, saying like, why do you get to tell me when dinner is? I'm not hungry, I'm not eating dinner. You don't want your kids saying that. I mean, you're like, it's dinner time, sit down for dinner. So the people in power would like the people without power to believe that the people in power have the right to tell them what to do. So if they don't accept it, if they don't think it's legitimate, they're not going to listen to you. Like if some stranger told my son, you better sit down and have dinner right now, my son would be like, who are you? I'm not listening to you. You're not my dad. So he somewhat accepts my legitimate authority over him. Anyway, but I have to shape it, help explain to him why it's a good idea to listen to your dad. I don't know if other dads have to do with that. But anyway, rulers have to do that. So what's a dominant racial ideology? It's a belief system created by elites. And conflict theorists say elites always do that. They create belief systems that help to do what? That help to justify and explain reality to people. To say to people, this is how things are. You're down there, I'm up here, and it's good. That's right. It's how it should be. In other words, it's normalizing the reality of the power situation in a society. Make people think it's just normal and natural that it should be that way. What's it trying to justify and explain? Economic and social realities in the society. And it wants people to just accept those realities and say that's how it should be. And because it is that way and it should be that way, then I'm not against it. And so if we look back at the history of America, according to Bobo and Smith, there's always been a dominant racial ideology in place, but it's changed over the years. As our economic and social realities changed, and who were the elites changed, the people with power, the ideology changed. For the first portion of our history, from about 1600, when the colonies first started, up through 1865, slavery was a very major social and economic reality of America. And slavery is a brutal system. The elites of that system need to justify it. They need to be able to say to the people in the rest of society, slavery's okay. It's fine that we brutalize people and force them to work for us and, make them die early deaths and take their children away from them and do all these horrible things. It's all fine. Why is it fine? Well, the ideology back then was based on a notion of genetic or biological inferiority. And this, according to Bobo and Smith, is really where we get the whole concept of race, the whole theory that God created these races and separated humanity forever into these separate groups, and some groups are up here and some groups are down here. It was to justify white supremacy. In other words, this system was based on a thing where white people get to have all these rights and powers over non-white people, and to justify and explain that, they came up with this idea that God had created Caucasians. And he also created other races, or Caucasoids they were called in the race theory, to make it sound really scientific. And you had the Caucasoids and the Mongoloids and the Semites and the Negroids. And the basic idea was Caucasoids are the real human beings. They have intelligence, they have souls, they have feelings. They need to be the masters. They are the masters, and other people are the slaves. Again, it was a binary thing from the very beginning to say that you have some people are slave, some people are master, and some people are black, and some people are white. And so it was a very binary system of you're either one or the other, and if you have dark skin, you're that, and if you have light skin, you're that. It all justified it to say God set it up this way. We didn't create this system, this binary system. God created it. And that's just how it is. And these other races, they don't feel pain the way we do. They don't have the intelligence we have. They don't have the souls we have. So don't worry, it's not a bad thing. Well, that all kind of made sense of slavery, and to this day, there's a lot of people, especially in the southern states of the United States, that still sort of believe this idea that if you're white, you're superior and better than the people that are not white. And therefore, you deserve more than they do. You deserve better jobs, better money, better country than the people that are not that. And so it's still with us culturally as a belief system. Most people have rejected it. The economic system that needed that belief system faded away. Slavery does not make sense economically after a while because of modernization, because of the development of technology like steam and electricity and a machine that can pick cotton on its own. So industrial capitalism took over early capitalism. Early capitalism was based on absolute surplus value, working people really long hours for no money. But industrial capitalism is based on factories and machines and using people to run the machines and paying people a wage to run the machines. And if you've got industrial capitalism from about 1865 on till about 1985, well, you need a new ideology for that, because now you need, if you're an elite that owns a factory, you want people to come work for you, and you want to pay them a wage, and you want to pay them a low wage, but you want to pay them the same wage. If you're the guy running the machines, I don't care what race you are, I don't care what color you are, I don't care anything other than will you run this machine for 8 hours a day for the pay I'm paying. And if you won't, then bye-bye, and I'll find somebody who will. And so I knew this old ideology of white people are better than black people and Mexican people and Asian people, that doesn't work in a society based on factory work. You need all those people working side by side. You need them all working for the same wage. So you need a new ideology that says, we're all the same, pal. God created us all equal. We're all equal. And therefore, what really matters is your work ethic. Are you going to work hard? Are you going to try hard? Are you going to serve the company? Are you going to have the gumption and the grit and the can-do attitude? Are you going to, rise to the top and try your hardest? That became kind of the dominant American ideology, the Horatio Alger story. Anybody can rise from rags to riches. Anybody can work their way up to the top. That became the new ideology that a lot of Americans bought into, and they didn't buy the idea anymore that if you're a different race, you somehow have to be lower than other people. You can work your way to the top too. And a lot of people really liked that ideology. And it worked really well for a long time in America to motivate people to be willing to work for wages for somebody else and not challenge that system and not feel like they're being exploited because they could see a chance they might be able to rise up too. But globalization is our new reality now. And our elites don't make money anymore by hiring us to work in factories. They make money by finding other people in other countries that will work in the factories. And because of that, we don't have the big social safety net. Under industrial capitalism, we built a big middle class that works in factories, that has houses and home ownership and those kinds of things. Well, all of that fit that ideology of if you work for the company, you'll be rewarded, you're going to get good stuff. Well, now the company doesn't want you to work for it. It wants to hire people that don't want a big house and don't want to make, good union wages. And so globalization has changed the economic situation for Americans. And the elites nowadays make their money in other countries in a lot of cases. So from about 1985, I said, is when globalization started taking off in America, when our factories started moving across borders. And Americans started finding themselves without good blue-collar middle-class jobs in factories and having to look for other kinds of work. So we don't know when that's going to. I'll put a question mark there. But the elites now are also having to justify the situation and try to explain, well, why have we seen such decline of our middle class? Why do we have such inequality where the 1% gets to be so rich and the 99% aren't going anywhere and haven't gotten raises over the last 30 years? Why are so many people losing their homes and don't get to live in them anymore and got foreclosed on? But then you bailed out the banks and gave them trillions of dollars, but the homeowners didn't get their houses back. Why did you send all our jobs overseas? Why did my parents and grandparents used to work in factories for good middle class wages and now I got to work at Walmart for nothing? People are asking these kinds of questions now, and the elites have to have some kind of answer that says, it's okay, it's fine, it's how it should be. What's the answer they give us? Well, they give us laissez-faire racism, basically, but the content of it is to say, well, the people who are below us nowadays, it's not their genes that put them there, it's their culture. It's cultural inferiority. It's the wrong values, the wrong ethics. You're entitled. You don't think you have to work hard. You're obese. You're just fat. You're just sitting around eating all the time. You're lazy. You're slackers. That's what they told my generation. We graduated college and there was no jobs around. So we started hanging out in Starbucks. And then they said, you guys are slackers. Generation X, get up and go get a job. And we're like, well, you sent them all to China. So anyway, but anyway, it's the people themselves, the workers themselves are getting blamed by this ideology. So when you ask American people, should the government help poor people find a job? They'll be like, no, none of us are getting jobs. They're all just lazy and entitled. Only the hardworking people should get the jobs, you know. But it's people saying that don't have a job themselves. But anyway, the point is a good example of it was welfare reform. Welfare reform was ended, or welfare was changed in 1995 when the Clintons were in office. And Bill Clinton said, I'm going to end welfare as we know it. And a lot of conservatives who aren't Democrats said, yeah, you're going to lower our taxes and stop, you know, giving money to people that don't deserve it or something. But also Democrats, why would Democrats get rid of a program that Democrats themselves created back in Roosevelt's time when we saved capitalism? And so they said, well, we need to get rid of it. We need to get rid of it for personal responsibility. That was the name of the act, the law that ended welfare, was the Welfare Reform and Personal Responsibility Act, I believe was the total title of it. So they made it sound like, well, we need to end welfare because people are being lazy and slackers and obese and entitled. And if we take away welfare, well, then they'll work really hard. And our country will really prosper when they do that. Well, a lot of women were told, stop staying home with your little children and take care of them and go get a job full time. And, you know, that's a problem right there because childcare, I don't know if you've ever tried to pay for childcare, but that costs $1,000 a month right there. So if you're going to go work for $8 an hour and pay $1,000 a month for childcare, that doesn't really pan out. That doesn't really pencil out as a possible lifestyle. So we told all these poor women on welfare, don't stay home with your children, go get a job, lady. And we didn't provide childcare and things like that very easily for people. So were we really demanding personal responsibility, or what was really going on there? In fact, also the question is there welfare fraud? I hear a lot of people around here complaining about welfare fraud. It's really not as big a problem as people think it is. It's much smaller than people think it is. In fact, a few states recently have started to say, well, let's drug test those people that are getting temporary aid to needy families. It's not called welfare anymore. It's called TANF, temporary aid to needy families, federal benefits for poor people, but temporary. But so some states have said, well, let's drug test you. If you're getting this free money from the government, let's drug test you. So they did drug tests in, I think, Arizona, and I think Michigan was another place. And then how many people actually tested positive for drugs? Almost zero. So we have this idea that all these poor people are just getting free money and spending it on drugs, when in fact of the matter is most people getting the money are giving it as food to their children. So when we take it away from people, we're taking away food from children, basically. Do we really expect children to take personal responsibility for themselves and go find some food? Maybe we do, but that means we're not as advanced as a society as we like to say. But the real reason isn't that. According to Bobo and Smith, the real reason they cut welfare had nothing to do with welfare fraud. That's like a tiny little piece of the budget, and it wasn't harming our budget. The real issue was globalization. Our biggest companies have left the country, and we're in a race to the bottom. So when they say, do you want any jobs in America from Exxon or Nike? Well, you better not charge us any taxes, because we can go to other countries that don't charge taxes. So why would we stay here? And if our government can't get tax money from the richest companies, then it can't use that money for things like welfare or public schools or a lot of the things that Americans used to take for granted. Public parks. Yuba County is really stressed out in terms of money we don't have for parks, for schools, for cops, for things like that. It's partly because we've cut taxes so much on the wealthiest people. And yet, Yuba County gets a lot of federal money, and a lot of the federal money it gets goes to rice farmers in the form of corporate welfare. So around here, a lot of Yuba County people hate on the poor people and say those people, they're on drugs, they're getting free money from the government to take their drugs, and nobody ever blames rice farmers for getting millions of dollars from the government. So that's a subsidy too. Nobody ever blames college students. You guys all sitting here are getting free money from the government to go to college. So, but anyway, it's an ideology that tends to focus all the anger on the people below, the poor people, the non-white people, the immigrant people, rather than looking at the top and saying, well, it's really our wealthiest people that have abandoned the country and stopped paying their fair share to the country. So that's Bowman Smith's argument about laissez-faire racism. I didn't quite finish it, but if you have any questions on the study guide between now and next Wednesday, you can email me. I'll try my best to respond. I am going out of town for the weekend, and I won't be back on Monday, so no class on Monday, but I'll see you here next Wednesday for the exam.